Before the Viking longship ever cut through dark northern seas, it began here, in the cold breath of a Norwegian fjord, where survival depended not on glory, but on what men could build with timber, iron, wool, and skill. To outsiders, the Vikings are remembered as raiders bursting from the mist. But the truth is far less simple and far more powerful. Behind every voyage stood a shipyard like this one, where the sea was studied as carefully as any enemy, and where a single flaw in wood or judgment could doom an entire crew. In a land of narrow fields, bitter winters, and hard horizons, ships were not symbols of adventure. They were instruments of necessity, trade, power, and life itself. And at the center of that world stood the shipbuilder, a man whose hands shaped more than oak. He shaped the reach of chieftains, the fate of families, and the future carried beyond the fjord. To understand the Viking world, you must begin not with the raid, but with the making of the vessel that made such a world possible. This was Western Norway at the end of the 9th century, where the land was narrow, the winters were long, and the sea ruled every decision worth making. Farms clung to thin bands of soil between mountain and fjord, never rich enough to promise safety, never generous enough to spare a family from risk. In such a world, power could not rest on harvest alone. It had to be forged in iron, spun into sailcloth, and carved from oak beside the freezing shore. A longship was not merely a vessel. It was a lifeline, a weapon, a road, and a chieftain's reach made visible in timber. Men like Einar were born into that hard arithmetic. He was not born to glory, but to labor, raised in a house where survival depended on weather, loyalty, and the skill of human hands. As a boy, he learned that timber could betray the careless, that the sea forgave nothing, and that mastery was earned not through pride, but through patience, judgment, endurance, and the quiet discipline to make necessity seaworthy. Before any warrior could depart, builders came first. By dawn, Einar's day began as most lives in Viking Norway did, without comfort, without ceremony, and without the fantasy of glory. The house was dim, the meal was plain, and the cold seemed to live inside every board, every wool fiber, every breath drawn before sunrise. Yet nothing in these small rituals was ever trivial. Each strap bound around the leg, each mouthful of dark bread and dried fish, each tool lifted, weighed, and tested in the hand, revealed a world ruled by scarcity, discipline, and consequence. He was not preparing for adventure. He was preparing for labor that could not forgive mistakes. Outside, frost still held the yard, and the unfinished hull waited among sorted timber, tar, iron, and rope, like a promise not yet earned. There, even the choice of a single plank carried the weight of lives unseen. A hidden knot could become disaster far from shore. A clean grain could carry men, trade, and power across the sea. In the Viking world, skill was never a luxury. It was survival made visible in the hand. At the shipyard, morning truly began when timber met judgment. Einar moved through the ordered chaos with the certainty of a man who knew that every curve of oak already carried a future inside it. Straight grain would become strength. Natural bends would become ribs. Iron would bind what skill first imagined. Nothing here was random. The Viking ship was not hacked together in haste, but assembled through knowledge sharpened by generations who had learned to read trees, weather, and water as parts of the same unforgiving language. With each measured line and each falling stroke of the axe, raw wood surrendered to intention. Around him, the yard awakened fully, workers hauling, smiths shaping, apprentices watching, all bound to the same task. The hull rising before them was more than a vessel under construction. It was the answer to a hard northern world, a machine of survival born from patience, geometry, and labor. Before it could conquer the sea, it first had to be made worthy of it. By midday, the ship no longer looked like scattered timber, smoke, and labor. It had begun to resemble intention made solid, a living structure rising from calculation, memory, and the discipline of many hands. Curved frames were lifted into place like the bones of some great sea creature. Iron rivets were forged in bursts of heat and hammered through overlapping planks, and tar-darkened wool was pressed deep into every seam to keep the water where it belonged. This was the hidden genius of the Viking world. Not only courage at sea, but precision on land. Einar understood that a ship's strength did not come from one heroic act, but from 100 exact decisions made before launch. A seam too loose, a line too uneven, a curve too proud, and the sea would remember every error. Around him, the rhythm of the yard became almost musical. Hammer, breath, wood, iron, fire. Piece by piece, the vessel gained its shape, and with that shape came trade, war, distance, ambition, and the power to turn a hard coastline into a road. As the ship neared completion, the work grew even more unforgiving. The mast step had to bear force, sail, wind, and distance. The seams had to hold against cold water and relentless motion. Every hidden joint had to survive what no eye on shore would ever see. But danger did not wait for the sea. It lived here already, in cracked planks, slipping tools, failing heat, wet timber, and the pressure of men who could not afford delay. Einar knew that the true cost of a ship was paid long before launch, in bruised hands, missed sleep, and the fear that one small mistake might follow a crew into deep water. The chieftain needed a vessel, the village needed its future, and the weather gave no mercy to either. So the yard pressed on through rain, injury, and strain, because in the Viking world, necessity did not pause for exhaustion. Before a ship could carry power across the sea, it first demanded sacrifice from everyone who built it. Even before launch, the sea was already testing them, mercilessly, from this shore. By evening, the greatest threat was no longer hidden in the weather, but in doubt itself. Inside the hull, Einar could feel what others might miss. A faint twist in the line, a subtle warning that the ship still carried imperfection within its strength. Nearby lay older vessels, scarred by salt, patched by necessity, their worn seams testifying that the sea never stopped judging the work of men. Around him, beams shifted, supports groaned, and heavy timber reminded every man in the yard how easily labor could turn to injury or death. Yet when the work finally gave way to night, another truth emerged. Beyond the ship stood the family, the hearth, the quiet hands that mended cloth and carried food, the child who traced the shape of a toy boat without yet understanding the cost of the real one. History would remember the voyages, the raids, the distant horizons, but lives like these were built in silence. And in that silence, Einar understood what truly rested inside the hull before him. Not only oak and iron, but hope, hunger, fear, and the fragile future of everyone waiting on shore. When dawn returned, the longship stood not as a fantasy of conquest, but as proof of how much a society could demand from ordinary hands. This was the truth hidden beneath the Viking legend. Before shields flashed beneath foreign skies, there had been wet wool, tar-blackened fingers, smoke, splinters, aching backs, and the stubborn repetition of labor. Einar knew that men would one day remember the voyage, not the workshop. The raid, not the repair. The fame of those aboard, not the exhaustion of those who made the journey possible. Yet the old hulls beside the yard, scarred and patched by years of salt and wind, offered a harsher kind of wisdom. The sea did not care for stories. It cared for balance, strength, and whether every seam had been earned honestly. Even food passed from hand to hand in the yard became part of that larger machine of survival. A ship was never built by one man alone. It rose from forge, farm, hearth, and shore together, until labor itself became the vessel that carried Viking ambition into the world. At last the ship met the water, and with that quiet, dangerous moment, months of labor were placed on trial. The hull settled, the seams held, and the longship that had once existed only in measured timber and human endurance began to breathe with the rhythm of the fjord. For Einar, this was not triumph in the way warriors understood it. There was no cheering glory in his work, only the grave relief of seeing wood, iron, wool, and judgment prove worthy of the sea. Around him stood the people who had made this crossing possible long before the first oar touched the water. The smith, the laborers, the women who spun and stitched, the family who endured the cost in silence. Soon others would take the vessel outward, into trade, war, and distant memory. But that was always the final chapter, never the first. The first chapter began here, on cold shorelines like this one, where ordinary hands made ambition seaworthy. And in that truth, the Viking world reveals itself at last. Where kings saw power, builders carried the cost.